Hello and welcome to the AITPM Online Technical Conference Series. Before we get started today, just a few housekeeping rules. Please come in muting your microphone and keeping your camera off. Look out for any additional instructions from your session chair toward the end of the session if they ask you to turn them on at any point. This session will also be recorded. Please allow up to 24 hours for the session to be made available on demand in the Online Technical Conference Series portal on the AITPM website. Do you have any questions for our presenters today? Simply post them in the chat function at the bottom of your Zoom screen. We'll address any questions towards the end of this session and also try to get to any questions that were submitted when you were watching the on-demand videos this year. The AITPM acknowledge the traditional owners and custodians of the various lands on which you all work today and the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people participating in this session. We pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging and celebrate the diversity of Aboriginal peoples and their ongoing cultures and connections to the lands and waters throughout Australia. The Online Technical Conference Series would not be possible this year without the support of our industry partners, Oricon, Matrix, SMEC, Stantec, and Veach Lister Consulting, including our sustainable transport partner, WSP, our network insights partner, AIMSUN, technical partner, GHD, and our academic partners, Monash University and QUT. Please stand by. This live Q&A session for the AITPM Online Technical Conference Series will start shortly.
Well, welcome everyone. It's certainly a pleasure to be here with everyone today. My name is Kevin John, and I represent Matrix Traffic and Transport Data. So we thank you for joining us for our session today. This afternoon, it's a pleasure to introduce the speakers who have joined us today on this online session. And we want to welcome Clemens Chan from the Department of Transport and Planning in Victoria, Harry Barber from Urban Transit Solutions, Ratish Vijayarajan from the Department of Transport and Planning, DTP, in Victoria, and John Devney from Tonkin. So thank you for all your fantastic video recordings on your projects and your initiatives. So we're going to kick off with Clemens Chan. So can you please give us a brief introduction? Who you are, what is the focus of your presentation, and why you chose this project initiative to highlight in this online technical conference series. Now, you're welcome to submit questions, and we ask you to please do that online. We also ask that you can mute yourself and turn your video camera off, and then we look forward to just enjoying our session. So welcome again, and thanks for being here. Over to you, Clemens.
Thanks, John. G'day, everyone. My name's Clemens Chan. I'm a senior transport modeler here at the Department of Transport and Planning here in Victoria. A big part of my job is to look at transport modeling, so strategic transport modeling, and its applications and how it's been used around Australia and Victoria. A big part of my passion is to take the technical part out of strategic transport modeling and put it in the hands of people who's without the technical knowledge behind strategic transport modeling, and put it in front of more people so that they have an awareness of what a strategic transport model can do, and also put that into consideration when they're planning for any of their transport initiatives. And therefore, my project is on how we can allocate residential growth in Victoria. So how we can leverage the existing high capacity transport network without necessarily congesting it too much and having overcrowding on our rail lines. Cool, so back to you, Kevin.
Thank you. That was short and sweet, and we're grateful for that. So we want to move on to our next presentation now. I'll just introduce us to our next presentation, which is going to be from, we have Harry Barber from Urban Transit Solutions. So let's pay close attention to Harry. And just a reminder, you can keep sending in your questions online, and we're going to get to that at the end of our session. Thank you. Over to you, Harry.
Thank you very much, Kevin. Hello, everyone. Looking forward to your questions. I'm writing a guide to road pricing and parking pricing called the Inside Guide. I'm publishing it in episodes for free on Substack, and you're welcome to join in and be part of that conversation. I'm really interested in pricing roads. The Productivity Commission said a while ago there's no way we can get sensible ticketing for public transport until we start pricing roads and parking, because if we start raising the peak time prices in public transport, people will just defect to the roads. So that's something to bear in mind. I guess the thing I'm trying to get across is that there may be one gantry and one camera and one cash register, but there's many different reasons behind that and lots of different road prices, and you've got to decide what you want to achieve. And my presentation was about the Manhattan cordon, which survives today quite remarkably in this new strange country called the United States of America that's emerged over the last few weeks. Still going, and going much better than I expected. My slightly conservative and potentially pessimistic take in December has been overturned so far. So look forward to hearing what you have to say.
Thanks, Harry. Thanks, Harry. We appreciate your short and sweet review there. We're now going to hear from our next presenter today, and that is Ratesh Vijayarajan from the Department of Transport and Planning in Victoria. So over to you, Ratesh. Thank you.
Thanks, Kevin. Myself is Ratesh Vijayarajan. I work as a senior transport and land use modeler with the Department of Transport and Planning. And I do work with the strategic modeling. So I'm in fact in the same team as Clemens. So I'm not going to repeat how strategic models are going to be used and all that. So we basically worked on the Victorian Integrated Transport Model, also known as VITM. So the presentation was originally done by Ajay Khatri, who unfortunately cannot be present today. So I am representing him. So the presentation talks about how we can look at the observed train data and how we can validate it in an alternative method. So right now, what we do in the model is comparing it with a fixed time interval, whereas this presentation was talking about if we look into like an alternative approach, a service-based approach on when the train service starts or ends or mid-time during the journey, and whether it will have any implication on how we analyze the data set. So the presentation shows how it will be of not much of an impact for metropolitan train services, whereas it will have an impact on long distance services or V-line. That's how we call in Victoria. So the presentation concludes that there is additional merit into looking into that level of detail when it comes to long distance train services. So yeah, I expect to hear some good questions today. Yeah, that's all from me. Back to you, Kevin.
Okay, thanks, Ratish. We're going to move on to our next speaker, and then I'm going to come back and ask you four speakers again on the next steps. But let's for now just get our next speaker involved. I'll just bring up the detail for him. So we're going to hear from John Devney from Tonkin. So John, tell us a little bit about yourself and your project. And then when we finished, like I said, we'll go back to all four speakers because we want to know the next parts of their projects and how they're progressing. But let's finish, John, doing your presentation first. Thank you, John.
All right. Thanks, Kevin, and thanks for being part of this online technical conference. I'm John Devney, and a principal transport engineer at Tonkin, based in Adelaide. And my topic is about a customer-focused bus stop assessment tool. And the idea was to develop a user's view in the planning, design, and maintenance of bus stops, and having some kind of assessment tool for that. And in my presentation, I talked about different classifications of bus stops. So you can have bus stops at stations or interchanges or off-road facilities, on major arterial roads or subarterial roads, and also on local collector and local streets. So there was a classification of bus stops. Then I proposed some bus stop design principles focused around access, safety, and security, providing bus customers assurance and comfort, and providing amenity at the stop, and also then understanding that all bus stops need a tailored type of infrastructure to suit the customer needs. So I developed a 10 criteria in the assessment tool, and they covered areas of amenity and security, access, accessibility and convenience, awareness, and information. And so they were used to score a selection of different types of bus stops. And the key outcomes of the tool was to actually include customer views or customer thinking when you're planning for and designing and maintaining bus stops. And I proposed 3 applications for this that we can talk about in the next steps, but basically how you could rate your bus stop, or how you can use this tool for councils to identify what their maintenance requirements are, but including a customer's perspective in this. Anyways, I'll wait for more feedback and questions, and thank you. Yeah.
John, thank you. We're going to go back to our first speaker now and just bring him back again, Clemens Chan. We want to ask this question. We're going to be asking it of each of our 4 speakers, so we'll take it in turn. So how will you be progressing the issues, the product, and the ideas to the next phase? Do you require any grant application support? And are you working through the government process or trying to sell it as a commercial idea? So what are your next steps of the project, please?
Yep, sure. Thanks, Kevin. So I guess it's worth just mentioning why we developed this in the first place, and it really is in response to the Victorian government's recent announcements about housing statements. So we're to locate houses around Victoria to support population growth. So basically, we've identified that we can't just keep connecting transport out to everywhere and all the greenfields, because tighter fiscal constraints and a budget won't allow us to keep connecting transport infrastructure out into the growth areas. So this tool is really designed for a quick short listing of options, so where we can locate houses without which will get good public transport, rail utilization without having congestion blowing out everywhere. How we are planning to take this forward is, again, sort of in response to activity centres announcements recently. So the Victorian government had once again announced that there's going to be clusters of activity centres in and around Melbourne's established areas. So really, we're just trying to adapt this tool for that need. And one of the limitations that I mentioned in my presentation is that it doesn't currently account for destination choice differences. So where we have differences in employment, the tool doesn't really account for it yet. So I'll be looking for ways to adapt the tool so that it really, as well as considering where residents are located, it would also account for changes in employment as well. Currently, we're not definitely not trying to release this as a commercial product. It really is used internally within the Department of Transport and Planning to support these government announcements. Thank you, Kevin. Back to you.
Thanks so much for that, Clemens. We're going to ask the same of our next presenter, who was Harry. Harry, are you able to address the us on that section of it as well, please. Thank you, Harry.
Yeah, certainly. I really think road prices are really important. I think the Manhattan thing, that's the first serious road price that we've seen in nearly 20 years, after the Stockholm was perhaps the most recent one that has survived. I'll just read you a bit from Washington State and why they run a road price on 2 lanes of one of their freeways. They say, we know we can't build our way out of congestion because there are limitations in funding. There's a lack of physical space, and then there are the environmental considerations. That means we have to get more out of the roads we already have. So at the moment, our state is out of cash, and one of the reasons we're out of cash is we're spending an unbelievable amount of money on freeways, which are going to be very quickly filled up. So I think road prices are really important. I'm trying to get across the idea that a gantry across the road doesn't just mean someone's collecting tax revenue. They're actually trying to shape the use of the road, and basically switch so that we have an alternative. We can say, okay, sometimes we need to make the road bigger, we need to make the train longer, but sometimes we need to take the people end of things and moderate the number of drivers who try and use the road at a certain time, and maybe moderate the number of passengers who turn up in the peak and get them to come on an earlier service. So I'm trying to get across a concept, so no government grants needed, but it'll be a challenge for my communication skills.
Thanks for that, Harry. Appreciate you giving us an update on your next steps and how you see your project panning out in the future. We're going to ask Ratish back. Same for you, Ratish. What do you see? What are the next steps? What's the process for you going forward? How do you see your project moving forward? Thanks, Ratish.
Thanks, Kevin. So the application of what we looked into, what was presented in the pack, was mostly on a project by project basis. So it doesn't mean like we are going to change the way we look at like a time period, fixed time period based analysis, like what we are doing right now. But say, for example, if you are looking into long distance services, so it is mostly looking into like train data. So like regional train services running from far away distances, there is merit in actually looking into like a service-based approach, because a fixed approach may not capture like an early peak, which falls outside the fixed time period analysis that we are following right now. So in terms of how we use it for validation right now, we are not going to change how it is applied in the model, but on a project by project basis, say, for example, somebody wants to look at services running from the region. Yeah, there is merit into looking into that and see whether there is like a peak load happening at any of those stations along the corridor that is not captured by the current method. So yeah, so that's the purpose. Back to you, Kevin.
Thank you, Ratish. We appreciate you giving us more detail there. John, we'll ask you back, and the same to you, John. Where's your project headed? What are the opportunities? What are the challenges you see? Thank you, John.
All right. Thanks, Kevin, and everyone. Yes, so the intention of this bus stop assessment tool was to have multiple reasons for it to be applied. One was so you could use it to rate your bus stop on the quality, the amenity, the safety, and identify issues at that stop. That information then would be reported back to the relevant council or agency responsible for the maintenance and upkeep of that stop. And I proposed it would be similar to the bike spot survey that was done in 2023 for bicycle users, where they could identify on a map and score and rate, the quality of the bike lanes or the bicycle network connections. And similarly, this could be done for bus stops across the metropolitan area, where people can where they've got more local knowledge on the quality and the issues. Instead of reporting them back to just as a complaint to the council, they could actually have a scoring framework to actually apply that. Secondly, it could be used as a ready reckoner for councils or state authorities to actually investigate the quality of their bus stops, and so they can do some kind of prioritization of which bus stops need upgrading or relocated or improved amenity or shelters. And then thirdly, it's a tool that could be used for more strategic transport planning research to identify, where are the areas in a metropolitan area where there's bus stops that need upgrading, or there's gaps in the network or whatever, and using it as a planning tool. So those are three potential applications, and I would welcome any feedback from anyone, the people who on this session or who watch the video, to provide comments back to me, so I can use that to then develop it further.
John, thank you. Much appreciated.
Thanks.
I'll ask the panel again. This question does come up from time to time. Well, I'll just go through and ask you to comment on this question. Do you think AI can replace the assessment process you are proposing, including improvements? And what would your experience and knowledge add to the process that AI would find hard to replicate or understand? So we'll go back to Clemens and see what Clemens feels about that question. Thanks, Clemens.
Yeah, that's a $1 million question, isn't it, Kevin? It's I mean, based on how AI is rapidly developing, probably at some point all of our jobs will be at risk. But a big part of what I love doing at the Department of Transport, and indeed what I did for this project as well, is really understanding how people like to look at data. So a transport model, anyone could sort of get into the weeds and look at the calculations there. But at the end of the day, if we don't really know what land use planners are really looking for, and how the human mind interprets the data, they understand it in a simple way, I think there's going to be a while until AI can sort of replace the need to understand how people like viewing data. But that's sort of my 2 cents. I don't have any further comment on AI.
Clemens, thank you. Yeah, look, in our experience as well at Matrix with traffic and transport data, AI will improve if we think the transport agencies that have funding and have dollars will need to invest in it heavily, to train it, to give it the intelligence it needs to provide the data that we currently use in the industry. So that's our take on it. So probably you're right. It's who's going to spend on an AI to develop it, because it just doesn't come out of the thin air. It does take intelligence. We'll ask Harry for his comment, please. Harry, what do you feel about AI and on your project, and what influence can it have at all? Thank you, Harry.
Perhaps not in the conceptual work that I'm sort of doing alongside my day-to-day professional work, but it's certainly in the professional work. I did a project for the City of Melbourne where I looked at 4 years of 4 years of parking bay sensor data all across the municipality. So it was millions of data points. It took us a bit of while to work through that. A lot of heads being banged on desks, and we got a pretty good idea of what the length of stay was and the differences between the different what was happening in well, even every bay in one particular street. And so we were able to go and say to the tree planting people, by the way, in so-and-so street, that's a really dud bay. No one's using it, so you can stick a tree in there whenever you want. And I think that I saw someone talking about AI, and they said, I did my PhD, it took me 4 years, and then I asked AI my PhD question, and it did it in 3 hours. So I think that for that sort of stuff, analyzing millions of data points and then being able to zoom out and see the picture and then zoom in and see what's different, I think it's going to be fabulous about that. But you've got to know what you're trying to achieve. It's one way I think about it. It's an Excel. It's a very advanced Excel spreadsheet, and you can do some fantastic things with Excel. But if you plug the wrong numbers into Excel and forget to link the right cells, then you can come up with something that's pretty awful. So I guess my simplistic understanding is that AI is the new Excel.
I think you're spot on, Harry, because it is going to only just use whatever intel we give it, whatever we tell it. So yeah, it can't make things up out of the air. So yeah, it's interesting. And Excel does the same thing. It's just what data we put into it. We're going to ask Ratish for his comment on the same question. Thank you, Ratish.
Thanks, Kevin. Yeah, I will concur to what Harry and Clemens were saying. It all depends on what we feed into the model, right? The algorithm needs to be decided. It needs to work properly. I believe like the whole replacement thing is a bit far away still, but in the meantime, the AI processes are helping to enhance the methods we use. So definitely the analysis that we did, it will definitely enhance it. We can process the data better. Nowadays, it's quite easy to do like to manipulate heavy data sets, process it. So those things will get better with AI. But in terms of like sense checks, whether the process makes sense, those things still needs to be carried by humans. But probably in the future, it will get replaced, but we are still not there. Right now, we are in a situation like probably if we need like 100 people before, we can probably do it with 10, but that 10 people needs to have a bit more higher skill than like an average skill set among 100 people. So AI is here to stay, but I think it is supplementing at the moment, but the far future, not entirely sure. Back to you, Kevin.
Ratish, thank you. And yes, I think we can agree that AI is here. It's not going anywhere. It's just how it's going to be developed and evolve, and how useful it'll be in the future. John, we look forward to your comment on that question on AI, please, John.
Yeah. Thanks. Yeah, AI is interesting, and it would be a different way of actually doing the assessment scoring, but it would need to try and understand what the different customer views are and perceptions. What I think would be so in this bus stop assessment tool, I've developed it so it's got assessment criteria that are very measurable and objective. And so what I'm suggesting is that it may not use AI, but it certainly could use a lot of smart GIS analysis to actually automate the scoring of all the different bus stops. So, so whether it's like weather protection, or whether it's got a shelter or not, or the amount of space, all of those things are quite measurable. And if they can be captured through some GIS, and that would be a way of actually speeding up the analysis and the scoring.
John, thank you. Well, thank you to all four of you for touching on that aspect. AI, people are interested in AI. We're going to look at the questions now that have been submitted. So thank you everyone for your questions. Please feel free to submit any further questions. We'll start with Peter Davidson, and his question was for Clemens. The approach you have developed seems to focus on the number of households. Infill development may have a very different demographic mix compared with the current residents of older suburbs. Is there a risk that new residents will have different propensity to use rail? Thanks, Clemens.
Thanks, Kevin, and really good question. Thank you, Peter. Absolutely, I think there is definitely a risk that the new residents aren't the same composition as what was already assumed there. So, if you assume a lot of retirees will move into an area, they will react very differently to if you locate a bunch of people of working age and also white collar workers, because white collar workers are more likely to take the train into the city for a city like Melbourne. I would say that that's probably not limited to my approach, but also the approach of even four-step modeling, because it just comes down to the assumptions that you put, your land use assumptions. But the good thing about my methodology is that there's actually multiple ways of cutting the pie. So I've just done a really quick example of using the select linked volumes divided by the number of households. The primary reason behind that is because the driver of this work was a housing segment where we locate households. But we could even actually just divide by the number of working population, and that would de-risk what you've identified there, Peter. But absolutely, it is something that I've looked at. It's just I just happened to pick households for this presentation, but absolutely.
Thanks, Clemens. And while you're there, we're gonna ask you another question. This is from Anthony Francis. His question, Clemens, does your work look at locating employment opportunities as well? And in brackets, he's noted that perhaps is a separate study that you haven't presented on yet. So he's questioning that. And then it's also asking, would it be preferable to try an integrated approach to origins and destinations to try to reduce travel? Thanks, Clemens.
Thank you, Kevin, and thanks, Tony, for your question. It doesn't currently look at locating employment opportunities. I think there's another layer of complexity when we're looking at employment locations. So just to take a step back, for a radial city like Melbourne, so a city centre right in the middle, and then just wherever you locate population around metropolitan Melbourne, you can pretty much assume that white collar workers would somehow travel into the city. Whereas the same assumption can't really be said for employment opportunities. So just because, for example, if you locate in regional Melbourne, a bunch of job opportunities there, it doesn't necessarily mean people actually will move there and actually work there. So I still have it, and it is an extension of the work how we can adapt the process to account for that. But I would say that technically you can do it using my process. It's just you reverse the origins and replace it with destination, and you can do the same analysis. But I would be very cautious, just because I think location of employment is quite different to how residential location works, just in reality and also in the model. I would say preferable approach, integrated approach to origins and destinations. I think I would also be cautious adding too many complexities into what's designed to be a simple approach. Like I said in my presentation, what I have proposed here isn't a replacement of a four-step strategic transport model, but it's to complement that process. And if you are finding that you're changing all kinds of land use, including employment opportunities or even shopping centers locations in the model, I would probably recommend using a four-step model, because it will account for a lot more than a simple process like what I've proposed would account for.
Thank you, Clemens. Thank you. A question for Harry. This is from Peter Davidson. The argument that Trump's transportation secretary is saying against the New York charge is that it is a slap in the face to working class. and New York City should not be reserved for an elite few. So setting aside the cynical nature of these claims, how do we overcome these issues to gain community support? Thank you, Harry.
Thank you, Kevin, and thank you, Peter. Look, it's a fundamental question. When these things come online, there are lots of winners and losers, and there are lots of losers who quickly work out how to become winners. So in Stockholm, there were a lot of what we might call colloquially white van trips through the cordon. They quickly disappeared, and the investigators found that basically the white van people had worked out how to do their job without crossing the cordon so often. And of course, the white van passes the cordon charge on to the consumer. So they might be anxious about what that'll do to their business, but not necessarily carry the cost. And in New York, we've already seen this. Someone was discussing in some of the chat in the New York Times, they squirt 6 vans in, I don't know, they were delivering fish or something into Lower Manhattan, and now they're thinking of having 5 vans sitting inside the cordon and then 1 van coming in, one big truck coming in and then unloading into the vans. So, and then you only have 1 cordon charge. So to some extent, what I say to people when we're discussing parking is these systems have to be adjusted in arrears. You can't predict what you're going to do. That's the purpose of putting the dollar price on it. You say, here is the cost, and then now work out a solution. What you can do, and it's unfortunate that Manhattan doesn't have this formally, but you can have a review period. So both San Francisco and Seattle in their curbside parking systems, they review it every quarter. And at that time, if you find that you've shut off parking around a manufacturing facility with blue-collar jobs, low-paid blue-collar jobs in it, then you can respond to that. So I guess the message is you need to put in some arrangements beforehand, some means-tested arrangements. But the main thing is to watch it afterwards and then guide the system where you want it to go through course corrections rather than through being a futurologist who can accurately predict the future. And there's very, very few of those, some number that gets very close to 0.
Harry, thanks for answering that for us. We appreciate the insight. We're going to go back to Clemens and his comment on AI. And I'll first read a little response from Anthony Francis, and then I'll ask his question. So Anthony said, look, AI could do the job, talking about whether, it can do the type of work that Clemens is talking about. But he said the type of work that Clemens' team has been doing requires a vision for the future of Melbourne. And AI can't do that. Well, he goes on to say, okay, maybe it can, but it wouldn't do it well. So here's the question. Is there any vision of Melbourne's future driving the work you're doing, Clemens?
Sorry, just trying to unmute there. There is a vision driving the work we're doing. I don't know if it's a proactive or a reactive approach, but it really is in response to the fact that we can't be allocating residential population the same way we have done historically, because we've just not got the money to keep building transport infrastructure to connect up all these growth areas. So my guess is it's a somewhat reactive approach to say, the population in Melbourne's not slowing down. How on earth are we going to accommodate that? And part of how we're accommodating that is locating and densifying areas which are already established and already has transport infrastructure that connects them up to places like the city or any other major activity centers. What we're doing here is sort of applying a transport capacity lens on top of that to say that yeah, you can put people where we have extremely high number of trains, but is that going to cause any issues with the transport network? And because it is a pretty big task allocating hundreds of thousands of people every decade in Melbourne. This just allows you to shortlist options for further testing. Thanks for the question. Then back to you, Kevin.
Thank you, Clemens. Appreciate your answer. Now, this one is for John. So, John, your question from Peter Davidson is, how do we decide how much to spend on improving bus stops as opposed to increasing services? Recognizing that equality and amenity are important, is there any evidence that bus stop design has an impact on demand? Thanks, John.
Thanks, Kevin. And well, I don't have any direct evidence, but I would always recommend putting in a higher frequency service and a more regular frequent service over upgrading the bus stop and the bus shelter. Also, with bus shelters, it really depends where they're located. So if it's in a high demand, busy location where you're going to have, and also in the inbound direction where there's a lot of boardings, there probably is some priority for doing that. Whether it actually makes people make a decision to take the bus, probably when it's inclement weather, they might be more interested in going to the bus shelter when they know they've got some coverage there and a better amenity. But the bigger factor I would suggest is increasing the frequency of the service and the reliability of the service. So what would be more useful is to have some kind of tracking, so you know when your bus is going to arrive. So there are apps now that can tell the customer when their next bus is arriving, and having that working more effectively is better than just improving the amenity. Furthermore, if you're on a bus route that is operating very frequently, then you probably don't need to be waiting at that bus stop as often or as long. So yeah, so anyways, that's my view on that. But yeah, always frequency over the bus shelter amenity, but also picking those ones that are where you know that you're going to have a lot more people waiting. Yeah.
So John, question from me, how much does cost impact the usage of the service versus the other factors you mentioned, frequency or quality of the service?
Well, that's the thing. So the running of the service, of course, is a higher operating cost, and that's a bigger cost. And generally, that goes back to the operator and the state government. Whereas quite often the shelters are the responsibility, and the bus stop amenity and the walk access to the bus stop is all the responsibility of the local council or whoever owns that shelter. So, yeah, shelters are. And bus stop improvements around bus stop amenity are not absolutely essential, but also it needs this is a much more complex topic too, because placement of bus stops also can look at the safety and amenity and where it's placed on the road, and is it close to a safe crossing point, and so on. So this tool that I'm proposing is really much more a high level guidance to shortlist the stops that are in more critical need of upgrading.
Okay, thank you, John. Now, a question for Ratish. So, Ratish, in any of the data capture, were there instances of train services when passengers were redirected to replacement coaches which could have underrepresented the peak demand?
Good question. So the data we receive, the observed data we receive is for all days across a year, but the Victorian model itself represents a typical weekday. So there is a data filtering process that happens before we do the comparisons. So we take out all the weekdays out, the public holidays, school closures. And on top of that, we cross-reference the data looking into disruptions. So we look at disruptions across each of the different metro lines and V lines. So there is a date-specific data where there are no disruptions happening, and that's the data that's finally utilized for comparison. So it is a refined process data set that's used rather than using data that involves any sort of disruptions, including replacement buses.
Okay, thanks, Ratish. While you're there, we might ask you one more question if you don't mind.
Yep.
So for the further work required of assessing the peak demand for regional trains, what are some of your initial thoughts of what would be required for the investigations? I mean, who else would you speak to? And would extending the peak period data capture that's beyond the 7 to 9 a.m. be up for consideration, please?
Well, for the general model usage, we won't recommend extending it because, as you have seen in the presentation, it doesn't affect how the metropolitan services are assessed. But when it comes to regional services or long distance services, say, for example, somebody wants to catch a train to reach Melbourne from a regional area like Geelong or further away, they will have to start sometimes before 7. So for that sort of services, it does have some merit. So in terms of using it, it should be based on a project to project basis. Say, for example, if there is a regional rail based study, there is merit in looking into a service based assessment, but not for like the typical application of the model. So we're not going to incorporate this into our usual assessment framework, but in terms of specific projects, like the one I mentioned, it definitely finds application.
Thanks, Ratish. Appreciate your considered response to that. We'll go to Harry now. Harry, we're going to ask you another question if you are okay to answer this one. So we're talking about this congestion charging, could Manhattan solve 4 problems, either one cordon charge? Let's ask you this. In recent news on the US moving to the end of the congestion charge was thrown a spanner in the works, right? So how does congestion pricing shake off the tag of revenue raising? For example, drivers in Singapore made a similar claim when the peak period was previously extended to include an earlier start time after drivers drove to work earlier to avoid the charge. So this aspect of revenue raising versus really trying to smooth the congestion comes into the picture. How would you answer that? Thanks, Harry.
Yeah, that's good. Well, revenue is a perfectly good reason to string a gantry over a road. But in fact, the Manhattan charge is a revenue-based charge because they're trying to raise billions of dollars to rebuild the subway. They've neglected it just over the last couple of decades, and they get derailments and all of the consequences of lack of investment in a railway system. And so the idea, the fundamental idea behind the Manhattan charge is to raise some money to fund transit. And the money stretches out to 100 kilometres. So I guess, the Victorian context, they're going to spend some money to improve the rolling stock and the engines on the Long Island line, which would be like, I don't know, imagine if there was the Ballarat railway line. And so some of the congestion charge in the very centre of Melbourne going to improve the rolling stock for the Ballarat District Railway Service. So fundamentally, this thing is a revenue raising charge. What they've done is sell it as, if we raise revenue, we'll generate all these other benefits. And so then you get a larger group of support for it. And eventually you're trying to win over the drivers who are driving around Manhattan with fewer cars on the road. And they seem to quite remark. I was quite pessimistic. I think if they'd started with their much higher charge, their like $30 Australian charge that they were planning to do in the middle of last year, they would have failed the revenue test. They wouldn't have gained revenue, and they would have cut traffic very severely. But for various reasons, including trying to help the Democrats in the last election, they paused the introduction, and they came in at half that fee. So now it's roughly $15 in Australian terms. And they seem to have hit a sweet spot. You know, they should quickly run out and buy a lottery ticket, I think, because they seem to have hit their revenue targets. There's reports the buses are running a bit faster, not perhaps hitting their timetables or their desired timetables, but they're running a bit faster. There's reports that it's easier to cross the road. There's reports that there are fewer collisions, perhaps because people aren't driving so aggressively. So they seem to have actually managed to do more than one thing. But I think the more you push after one of those goals, the less that you will do the others. And I think if they're getting enough money to fund the loan that they want to rebuild transit, I think they'll hold on that position and not worry if they haven't adjusted pollution or if they haven't adjusted bus speed sufficiently. That's my guess. But of course, as you said at the beginning of the question, there's a large orange cyclone operating in that area at the moment, and who knows what damage it will cause. It may be like Hurricane Sandy and will knock out large parts of New York. We'll see what happens. Totally unpredictable.
So coming closer to home, Harry, we're talking about time of day congestion charging, if you like.
Yep.
This, Sydney has that de facto system, if you like, when you use the Sydney Harbour Tunnel. Have you looked closer to home, to a city more akin to Victoria? Have you looked at the evidence from the charging to use the Sydney Harbour Tunnel and the effect on congestion there with the time of day pricing?
Well, there's not a lot of public information. I think one of the things, Sydney has a fabulous toll regime up on Pennant Hills Road, where they, if you drive a heavy truck up Pennant Hills Road alongside the new Connex tollway, then you'll be charged $200 to go along the surface road. So I suspect they'll be getting quite a few trucks in the tunnel and not too many trucks on Pennant Hills Road. But I don't think that concept isn't applied more widely. At the moment, there's a nearly empty tunnel underneath the Sydney CBD, the Eastern Distributor. It's bankrupted 2 private toll companies because people aren't using it. And that's because it's free to grind your way across the CBD. So I think they could apply the Pennant Hills method and say anyone who comes in to the CBD from either the east or the west, and we pick up coming up on the other side and they haven't gone through the tunnel, will you do a double tunnel fee? So it'll be cheaper to go in the tunnel. That'd be good for everyone. And you wouldn't care if you made no money at all on the double tunnel fee, because you'd have put all of that through traffic into the tunnel. So I think there are, to go to your question about the under the harbour tunnel and the harbour bridge, they have different prices at different times of day, but they're not linked. As in Singapore, they watch the speeds very closely, and they would set a design speed. They would tell everybody what the design speed was. It's 30 kilometres an hour on a surface road, and perhaps on the Sydney Harbour Bridge, they might raise it to 60 kilometres an hour. And then they would just tell everybody, the last 2 months, the last 3 months, we're seeing speeds on the Sydney Harbour Bridge of 40 kilometres an hour. Too many cars, we're going to put the price up. And they will equally say, the speeds are going up to 70 kilometres an hour on the Sydney Harbour Bridge. So we can put the fees down. And every quarter, the Singapore sort of tolling authority, not to give them their proper name, but the Land Transport Authority. So they publish a thing saying it's up here and it's down there, and we're holding it here, and it's going up a lot there, and so people can see that the fees are being set by the load that's on the road system. So we don't have, I would call that real, well, I prefer to call it load-based, because you're not saying, oh, it's this time of the day, I must put the fees up, but the fees do change by the time of day. And in electricity, they call it time of use pricing, but actually that's load-based pricing as well. They don't put the fees up just because it's 6 o'clock in the evening. They put the fees up at 6 o'clock in the evening because that's when the load comes on the system and the solar panels switch off and the power stations come under pressure. So I'd like to get across the idea of load-based pricing, which would mean the fees would change by time, but it would be judged by load and people would understand it as speed.
Yeah, thank you for that explanation, Harry. It's quite the conundrum, isn't it? What's going to work? So we'd like to see what happens in the future with your project and how it works, because so many different authorities have tried different methods of charging some form of congestion fee, or like you said, a time of day fee or a load fee. The Singapore one seems to work well by all accounts. So
and I think if I can have one more, 10 seconds, I just want to say, and you could actually just test it on Wednesdays. You could take the Westgate Bridge, or you could take the Anzac Bridge, or the Story Bridge, and you say, on Wednesdays, we're going to try this and we'll see what happens. And you could prove it on Wednesdays. And then you say, okay, we'll do Thursdays as well. And you could build it up quite easily, but it would take a bit of guts to get the first trial in.
Okay, so Harry, some final words from you, and then we will go to each of our presenters just for the same final words, because we are close to wrapping up with 3 minutes to go. Thank you, Harry.
Cool. Well, I guess, please jump on the Substack if you want to read about this sort of stuff in more detail. I'll try and make it fun. And remember that there are different road prices. Some raise revenue, some try to keep the speed on the road, and some, like the one they have in London, tries to reduce the number of vehicles on the road. And whenever you're reading about prices, just see if you can work out which one they're actually talking about.
Harry, thank you. We appreciate your final words. Ratish will give you an opportunity. Final comments as we wrap up. Thanks, Ratish.
Thanks, Kevin. Thank you, everyone, for coming up with questions and listening to what we had to present at the Department of Transport Forecasting and Evaluation. We will continue to develop methods and alternate process, just looking into how we can enhance the data we provide, supporting a better future for Victoria. So in case you have any questions or like concerns around how we use our data or alternate suggestions, please do get in touch. Thank you.
Much appreciated, Ratish. We'll go over to John. Thanks, John. Final words.
Yep. Let me turn this on. Thanks, everyone, and thanks, Kevin. My comment is with bus stops and shelters, quite often they're seen as being the unloved infrastructure in public transport. And so, when you've got, train stations and a lot more expensive infrastructure, but it's important to actually consider the upgrading of bus stops, because it has a perception on people's image of using the bus. And quite often buses are seen as a second to trains and light rail and trams. So I think there is a role to make sure that there is a high standard of bus shelter, especially for people who've got some mobility and accessibility issues.
Much appreciated, John. Thanks for your presentation.
Thanks.
Clemens, you have the final say. Thanks, Clemens.
Thanks, Kevin. I'll try to keep it short. Thank you so much, everyone, for tuning in. Feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn, and we definitely have a chat. Always interested to see how people use innovative ways to show transport modeling outputs to continue using an evidence-based approach to inform decision making. So thank you again. Back to you, Kevin.
Yeah, thanks for that, Clemens. Well, thank you to everyone for attending the session today. We appreciate that. Erica and Victoria, thank you for your help behind the scenes work. Take care, everyone, and you can always watch this program in the future. It'll be there, it'll be recorded. Bye for now.